Good morning. My name is Jennifer Hiltwine. I'm a member of CIT's CRCF team, and I'm really pleased to have you guys join me for today's webinar that's focused on completing the budget and budget narrative for FY16. All callers have been placed on mute for this session. You may submit questions at any time by expanding your webinar control panel and keying your question into the questions box. All questions will be addressed during the Q&A time at the end of the prepared remarks. As with all CRCF webinars, the slides for today's presentation will be made available online on the solicitation webpage by close of business today. This session is being recorded, and this version will be available to view by midweek, along with last Friday's webinar on the application process. During this webinar, we will focus on CRCF matching funds and what can be considered matching funds, completing the budget, both the budget and budget narrative tabs on the template, and then cover a few tips to consider as you're preparing your application and associated financials. As I mentioned, we'll close out the session with an opportunity for Q&A. First, we'll take a look at matching funds in the context of those monies that are supplied toward the project, not in the context of CRCF's matching funds program. Matching funds that we're discussing here are monies that are supplied by the CRCF applicant that meet or exceed the amount of funds requested for the project. The match must mirror both the total and annual amount of funds requested through CRCF. Matching funds are a required element for the commercialization program, Eminent Researcher Recruitment Program, and the Matching Funds Program. Matching funds are not required for the SBIR or STTR matching funds programs, as the match component is fulfilled by the federal SBIR or STTR award. Matching funds cannot be identified or secured after the CRCF award is made. Matches must also be active and available during the proposed CRCF project's period of performance. For example, if an applicant secured matching funds during a 3-year grant and are wrapping up year 1 of this award, funds that have already been expended cannot be used as matching funds. Neither can funds that will be expended after the CRCF period of performance. Matches, at a minimum, must be 1-to-1. Examples of matching funds can be seen on the slide here and within the CRCF FAQs document. These include labor and/or fringe, consumables, purchased equipment, and federal, private, or other grants or contracts for the same work proposed in the CRCF application and aligned with the CRCF project's period of performance. Waived indirect costs are also acceptable sources of matching funds. You would not be asking CRCF to cover your overhead and/or G&A costs, but these would count towards your 1-to-1 match. In general, whatever contribution is made must be specific to the CRCF project. Funds that are received from the CIT gap funds or state contracts or grants are not eligible sources of matching funds. If you are a university applicant, however, contributing the salaries or indirects, which may be state monies, are an acceptable match. The budget and budget narrative templates are within a single Excel document, but are broken down into 2 separate tabs. Both the budget and budget narrative must be completed and uploaded, still as a single Excel document, into your online application. Templates for the budget and budget narrative, like that for the proposal, are program-specific and available for download from the URL on your screen, and then by clicking on the specific program. Matching funds, if they're applicable, should be recorded and explained with the required level of detail on both the budget and budget narrative. This level of detail is called out in each set of guidelines, but is also available within both tabs of the budget template. On the budget template, you'll see a combination of white and yellow cells. Enter data for your CRCF budget into the white cells. Yellow cells are formula-driven and locked. These cells will auto-populate based on the numbers you enter into the white cells. If your CRCF project will last longer than 1 year, contact the CRCF team at crcf@cit.org to request a multi-year template. Additionally, on both the Budget and Budget Narrative tabs, be sure to enter the CIT reference number and project title in the appropriate blanks. The CIT reference number is a unique number CIT assigns to your project at the time your LOI was converted into a program application. This number can be found pre-populated within your online questionnaire. This is a sample of the commercialization program budget template. However, all program templates will look very similar. The bottom of each budget has cells to calculate the percentage of CRCF requested funds for direct and indirect costs. Those projects requesting funds to cover direct costs are reviewed more favorably. Direct costs are those costs going specifically towards the project, such as labor, materials, or consultants, while indirect costs are those such as overhead or G&A, costs of doing business that cannot be solely directed for the CRCF project. Program-specific caps exist on indirect cost, so as you're preparing your project budget, consult the guidelines for this information. To complete the budget, note the budget categories by line. Columns separate the CRCF request and match. A reminder that each match, for programs that require one, must equal or exceed the total amount of CRCF requested funds. If you are an applicant under the SBIR or STTR matching funds programs, additional matching funds may be provided, but are not required since the federal award serves as the match. Therefore, the column for the match and the corresponding section on the budget narrative need only be completed if additional funds are provided. The purpose of the budget narrative is to understand how the applicant expects to spend CRCF funds. It also identifies the source or sources, amount, and use of matching funds. For CRCF funds intended for indirect costs, cite the requested rate or rates, your organization's approved rate or rates, and who approved the rate, for example, a federal agency. Like with the budget worksheet, when filling out the budget narrative, enter data only in the white cells. All white cells have wrap text enabled, so when you're submitting, make sure this is still intact and that all of your content is visible. This will help CRCF reviewers capture all of your information during the review process. Please note that correctly completing the budget, and especially the budget narrative, are expectations of all submitted applications. Review program guidelines carefully for the required level of detail in the budget narrative. Applications that do not comply with program guidelines will not advance past initial review. An example of the commercialization budget narrative is seen here. At a high level, each budget narrative should explain the amounts and categories of requested and matching funds and detail how these monies will be used and what they cover. In all cases, we ask you to provide as much detail as possible. All requests are closely scrutinized and must be justified as critical to the project's success. I'll use the next minute or two to provide some examples of what we're looking for on a budget narrative. For example, if funds on the budget are allocated for labor, your narrative should explain the who, what, and how much. For another example, say you have 2 researchers supported by the same CRCF project. Indicate the salary for each person, time they will spend working on the project, and in total, the amount requested for their labor. If funds are expected for fringe, indicate the fringe rate, how you came up with this rate, and what it covers. Under consultants and subcontractors, you might put funds towards an attorney or patent filings, or a subcontractor who will process samples. In this category, explain the funds requested and what they will cover. Also indicate the location of the subcontractor or consultant. If any work will be done outside of Virginia, this must be explained and justified. Also indicate why this particular individual was chosen. As a final example, if CRCF monies will be directed toward equipment, described what is being purchased and its use for the CRCF project. A reminder that CRCF is not a major equipment acquisition program. If limited funds are being sought for equipment, applicants must indicate why alternatives to procurement, such as leasing or using an equipment at another organization, are not viable and need to demonstrate that the equipment is required to advance development of the specific product or technology proposed for the CRCF project. Indirect costs may not be charged on equipment. Lastly, one question we routinely get is whether items are considered materials or supplies or equipment. CRCF defines materials and supplies as consumables, disposables, or other short lifespan items. These are typically less expensive than items categorized as equipment. Equipment has a useful life of more than 12 months. Although CRCF does not provide sample proposals, this year we have prepared and made available a sample project budget narrative. The URL to download this document will be available on a following slide. In our application webinar, we cover tips to create strong proposals. I highly recommend that you register to participate in the next session in mid-January, or check out the recording of last Friday's session when it's available online in a couple of days. Today, I'd like to highlight a couple of tips to keep in mind when preparing your project budgets, as these are things that we've seen or not seen in some of the strongest overall applications. Reviewers look for precision in the budget and that requested funds are appropriate and specific to the proposed project. We recommend that applicants run their own calculations to ensure the total amount of requested funds equal, for example, the rate of pay for a key personnel and the amount of time that they'll commit to the project. Overall, there should be consistency throughout the proposal and budget, such that information included in the budget or budget narrative maps to the key personnel and work plan. Finally, and I can't stress this enough, you must use current program-specific templates for your FY16 project budgets and proposals. If your submissions are not prepared in accordance to the guidelines, including the format and content, it will not advance past the initial review. Again, all templates can be downloaded from the program pages from the Documents window in the top right-hand corner. Complete information on the FY16 solicitation is available via the URL on your screen. Here you'll find an FAQs document that addresses many common questions about CRCF, that sample budget that I mentioned, and links to register for additional webinars or view those that have already been concluded. Today's session will be the last before the holidays, but we'll offer another similar to today's presentation and one on the application process and proposal components in mid-January. Should any of the previously mentioned resources not give you the answers that you're looking for, my team will be glad to help. We can be reached at any time throughout the solicitation via crcf@cit.org. A reminder that all applications are due by noon on Monday, February the 1st. This concludes the prepared portion of the webinar. I'd now like to invite any questions that you may have at this time. Again, questions can be submitted by expanding the webinar control panel and using the questions option. I'll address everything in the order that they come in to the best as possible for the benefit of all participants. If a question requires more information, I'll follow up with that individual separately after the session. So we have a question here about whether the funding can be used for development or marketing or both. So depending on the program, for the private sector, up to 10% of the CRCF requested funds may be used for market validation. So if you have a project and it requires going out and validating that there is a market for the technology, perhaps it's talking with beta customers or things like that, this year we will allow up to 10% of the cost to cover those activities. If there are any participants on today's call who are matching funds applicants, so from the universities or other research organizations, the cap on market validation is 5%. 10% for the private sector, and 5% for universities and other research organizations. So our matching funds typically direct labor. We do see a lot of matching funds that come through as waived labor charges, so that it's a very common source of matching funds. We also will see waived charges for consultants' fees or subcontractors who will be participating on the project. Likewise, we've also seen organizations who have used equipment or materials that have been purchased as part of the CRCF project. Those costs are provided, or those items, excuse me, are provided in kind and would serve as the project match. So we have a question about whether you can request the cost for FDA approval. So if FDA approval is a key component for your CRCF project, funds could certainly be directed to help advance those activities. They would fall, I believe, under the other direct costs category. And certainly, again, if that was something that you were pursuing, that would be an appropriate source of matching funds as well. For any costs that are requested for CRCF, it's important in that budget narrative to explain the reason for those costs, why they're critical to the project, how they were reached, and things like that. So the level of detail that we're looking for are, again, within the guidelines and within the templates themselves. And I stress to please pay attention to that as you're preparing your budget narratives. I'll take just a second to mention that the FAQs document that's available for download from our solicitation main page, there's a section in there on the budget and use of funds and another specific to matching funds. So as you're going through and preparing your project budgets, I expect that most of you may not have quite reached that point yet, but you're thinking about it. So as you're preparing those, to go through that FAQs document and visit those sections, it may give you some additional information, examples of matching funds, what should be categorized as what, so things are addressed in that document. And certainly, as I'll mention a couple more times, I'm sure, before this is over, we'd be glad to help you out and address any questions that you may have as you prepare the budgets or any other part of your application. And we can be reached at the email address on your screen, crcf@cit.org. We have a question about whether there's a way we can get a copy of the slides, and definitely. The slides will be available by the close of business today on the solicitation main page, and by midweek, a recording of this session will also be available that you can view, share with colleagues, revisit as necessary if you need to look back into something that we talked about. I'll also put in a plug for our application process webinar. If you haven't participated in that or don't plan to in January, I highly recommend that you view that recording when it's available. Most specifically is that this year we've provided tips for strong proposals and go through some of the components that we're looking for or not looking for in the proposals that we receive. We're here to help all of our applicants create the best and strongest applications, and I do recommend that you check out that webinar like these. It's about 20 minutes or so, and you can view the recording midweek, and the slides for that presentation are also available now. So patent costs are an appropriate source of a CRCF request, and those can be under the consultant category. It may also fall under other indirect costs along with licensing fees, and really that would be up to you, and we'd be glad to work with you to identify the best category. But yes, patent costs for the technology are an appropriate source of a CRCF request. I really appreciate you taking about half an hour out of your morning to participate in today's session, and we really look forward to receiving your applications in February. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.